This is from Romans 3, 9 through 17. Well then, should we conclude that we Jews are better than others? No, not at all, for we have already shown that all people, whether Jews or Gentiles, are under the power of sin. And the scriptures say, no one is righteous, not even one. No one is truly wise. No one is seeking God. All have turned away, and all become useless. No one does good, not a single one. Their talk is foul like the stench from an open grave. Their tongues are filled with lies. Snake venom drips from their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. They rush to commit murder. Destruction and misery always follow them. They don't know where to find peace. They have no fear of God at all.
My entire formal education, right, from kindergarten all the way through college, Christian schools. I went to Christian schools my whole life. And during my elementary and high school days, I didn't just attend like one of these big Christian schools, like Christian schools where they're just basically prep schools, but they've been Christian for so long that they still keep the name. No. I went to the serious Christian schools, right? Like where the whole point is to get all of us little kiddos indoctrinated so we knew all the right answers and could defend the faith. Now, I'm not necessarily against the indoctrination of children. I mean, whatever. Everyone does it, right? There's not just Christian schools. There's Jewish schools. There's Muslim schools. Whatever. If a parent wants to send their kid to a school like that, fine. Kids are going to have to work it out when they're older anyway. But, anyway, my elementary school was really big in this kind of like Christian part of the Christian education, right? Their slogan actually was educating for eternity, which is a really big goal, isn't it? Like, preparing you for college is big enough, but we got our eyes on the unending, eternal timelessness that awaits you. Educating for eternity. I still remember that. I don't remember much about that time. I don't know why that is. I've got my theories. But I still remember in kindergarten, kindergarten, right? I loved my kindergarten teacher. She was awesome. And I still remember every morning we would do catechisms. Or you know what catechisms are? Like where you can teach a child or an introductee to the faith the doctrines of your religion through questions and answers, right? So I don't remember all the questions. I don't remember all the answers at this point. Bad little kindergartner. But I do remember one that was, what is sin? And then we would all say, sin is the bad things we do. Right? That was the answer. For like a 5-year-old, 6-year-old. Like, sin is the bad things we do. And I guess that's all you can give a kindergartner, right? But as we grew, we learned more. What makes things bad? What makes some things bad and some things good? And as I learned more, I kind of had this idea that it was given to me that, some kind of authority says that certain actions are bad or that certain actions are good. And that's kind of how the view went for me, right? For a very long time, my default view of God was the grand authority figure. I mean, we called him Father, right? And what is a father other than the person who, when faced with a demand of why, says, because I said so? So in the face of all this, right, I came to understand that God had certain rules that I was to follow, laws, right? And being this infinite divine being, the laws that he could come up with were infinitely binding. And so to break this law, right, to not follow the rule, to break the law of God had a name, and that was what was called sin. Like, that was what I thought about the word sin. It became for me this word that meant breaking divine law, an act that went against God's laws and therefore justly deserved whatever punishment God saw as fair. And of course, there was this idea that you could be forgiven of sin, right? And that offer and that promise were held out very openly in the churches I attended. And yet, for all the kind of wild frenzy and put on gratitude about forgiveness of sins, freedom still eluded everybody. Right? You didn't see people feeling or acting like they had not broken divine law or that they weren't still bound to it. And the reasons were like various. God still expected that you don't sin even after you're forgiven, right? So that was one. So what would happen is, like, we still did, of course, the bad things that God didn't want us to do. And so you got caught in these endless cycles of like praying and asking for forgiveness. But, maybe many of you experienced this feeling. No one would ever answer back. And so you were always kind of stuck wondering if maybe God hadn't like forgiven it, or maybe you weren't sincere enough when you asked and so it didn't count. Or maybe that's not your story at all. Maybe that's just my neuroticism. But maybe you were told something else, right? Maybe your experience was similarly fear-based. Maybe you were told that something natural about you was sinful, stood in the breaking of divine law, and so you didn't even try to seek forgiveness, right? Simply gave up, assuming that you would never be on good terms with God. Or maybe you didn't think about this cycle of forgiveness, but simply lived in the shame and isolation from the bad things you did. Or maybe you had none of this, and you look at your friends who were raised as Christians and you think, man, you guys are nuts. Whatever your story is, most of us hesitate to use the word sin, right? Personally, I don't use this word a lot in my daily vocabulary. I don't think I've ever said the word sin, like just that word itself, to my sons. Which means that they've heard the word thousands of fewer times than I had by their age. Right? For many of us, we have these experiences that were fairly negative, and so we don't want to beat people over the head, like maybe we were beat over the head for actions that now we see aren't actually even wrong. So we hesitate to use the word. Many of you maybe have taken it even further than that. Right? Like if you had to describe your view of humanity, you would scoff at any idea of original sin. Looking at you, Ryan. If Augustine and Calvin were walking on the side of the road and Ryan drove past them, he'd roll his window down and he'd blast Sarah McLachlan's Adia. He'd be like, "We are born innocent," right? Just to make them mad. You know the feeling, you know it. But here's the thing, right? There's something more than like the touchy-feelies going on in our world, right? For as much as we all love to belt out "We Are Born Innocent" with Sarah McLachlan. We all do that? That's not just me, is it? Come on, Adia, that's a good song. As much as we all like to belt it out in the car, we are often still left asking when we look at our world, like, what is going on? Right? Like, we all agree that forcing people to live in guilt and shame over things that aren't hurting anyone is destructive and wrong. Like, we all agree on that. But there's also, like, this thing that's at work. Right? Like, why are there preachers who get up for 40 years and preach hellfire and brimstone against the wickedness of drugs and homosexuality and then get caught with a kilo of coke and 5 male prostitutes? Right? Like, what is that about? Let's move outside the religious sphere. Like, what is it about humanity? Like, does it really address the mother's pain who's seen her children slaughtered in the streets before her eyes by an opposing political group to say, we're all born innocent? What do we do when we see young women kidnapped, forced to work as slaves in the international sex industry? I realize that this isn't a very child-friendly sermon, is it? As they're coming in and out of the door. What words can we use for when a land that has been in a family for generations is stolen, stripped, and sold by a larger, wealthier nation? Like, there are things in our world, right, that go on that no matter what our doctrinal or our religious or our political orientation, they don't sit right with us, and we recognize them as wrong. What is the principle that is at work within all of these occurrences? What is the principle at work in our world that seems to continue to bring destruction? What's going on with ourselves that sometimes we tear at the very fabric of our own being? Can we give a name to that? To the thing that is getting itself worked out during those times? If you think about the passage you just heard read, right? Paul's quoting the prophet Isaiah. There's no one who is righteous, not even one. There's no one who has understanding. We've all turned aside. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues deceive, right? The venom of vipers is on their lips. Their feet are swift to shed blood. That's heavy. That's intense. But life feels like that a lot, doesn't it? I'm not trying to say, of course, that everyone is always destructive at all times to each other. I mean, think about the countless stories of beautiful acts of courage and love and peace that we see from human beings all the time. That's not the point of this passage. It's not the point of other passages that sound like it. Right? A lot of people have a problem with some of these texts in the Bible, like the one you just heard from Romans. You'll hear people say things like, oh, the Bible's just so negative, right? It's just a bunch of do's and don'ts. Do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. Or, man, the Bible's just a tool to make people feel bad about themselves so that they have to, like, run to the protective care of the church and then give money to it. But all of that comes from the fact that there's just a lot of bad speaking and explaining about the idea of sin. The reason so many people have that view is someone probably gave them that view. Explaining sin in those ways misses the mark. See what I did there? And that's unfortunate because if you look at the way that the Bible, and specifically the New Testament, flows, like, it's the experience of people trying to do something about all this destructiveness. The Bible does talk a lot about the word sin as it's translated. But it's all in the context of solutions to it. Right? It's in the context of recognizing that this power of this principle that seemingly has like an endless supply of demand on us is actually not all that powerful when we see how it functions. Right? And that is why this sermon fits within our discussions of transformation that we began last week. Because after seeing, like, it's about seeing ourselves change. It's about seeing the others around us change fundamentally so that we don't have to live with the destruction, the strife, the anger, the murder, the ruin, the misery, all the things you hear from that quoted passage from Isaiah. The things in that list are all around us. People do run into their own ruin. They do run to their own misery all the time. It's everywhere. To deny that fact really only serves to keep people trapped in misery and ruin. To ignore it is to perpetuate it. But to engage with it, right, and to look honestly at it, can give us the power to actually transform. So talking about the word sin isn't something that should drive us apart from each other or lead us into judgmentalism or something that we can use to, like, you're a sinner, but I'm not a sinner. Right? It's not a way to build an us versus them. It's actually the way forward for us to heal our broken relationships. In fact, that's the main point that Paul is even making in this passage. And if you were to look right before, the point he was making to the Roman church that was struggling with identity issues is, look, Jewish folk, you aren't better than non-Jewish brothers and sisters, and non-Jewish folk, you're not better than your Jewish brothers and sisters. We all have worked to destroy each other. Let's just embrace that this principle, right, this sin, is at work within all of us. It sets us all on the same ground. It doesn't allow anyone to stand in superiority over somebody else. So the first point, right, in this discussion is that I want to say that sin is universal. What I mean by that is that it's everywhere, right? It's everywhere. And it's something everyone has to deal with in one way or another. There's always this kind of destructive escalation that occurs within us towards others. Right, when we talk about, well, we'll talk about it a little later, but I want to start with a story about, to tease the idea of, like, where does sin, this principle of destructive behaviors within ourselves and others, come from? My sons fight a fair amount, right? It's not constant. They don't fight constantly. But there's not a day that goes by. There's not a day that goes by where they don't fight. Right? It's going to happen at least once a day. And recently, Eldon's developed this really just great go-to move, right? He's got a couple phrases that he uses pretty often, switches them out. They mean basically the same thing, but Braylon will come and, I don't know, take a toy or whatever. Whatever the thing is that irritates Eldon. Nothing ever, like, super serious, right? Like maybe takes a toy or slaps him or something. And Eldon says, bruh, bruh. He calls Braylon bruh, bruh. Bruh, bruh, I want you to die. Okay, right? That's 0 to 100, isn't it? Like an accidental push, an elbow, the theft of a $2 toy, punishable by death. It's very extreme. Or he'll say this, I never see you again, which means I never want to see you again, right? So like, I'll be like, Eldon, you got to be careful with that milk. He'll be carrying this like giant like gallon of milk, and I could tell. I'm not even getting on to him. I'm not saying don't. I'm just like, be careful with that milk, bud. I never see you again. You get onto him at all, he never wants to see you again. Now, part of this is that he's 3 years old, right? He doesn't understand the actual impact. If I was like, fine, I'm out. See ya. Take care of yourself. He doesn't understand that he would die within like 36 hours. But part of it, too, is that there is this thing that comes very early in our lives where we're going to one-up somebody else, right? If you did something, it's like Lamech in Genesis. If you injure me, I'm killing your entire tribe, right? This is like what Eldon has at 3 years old. Like, you hurt me, I kill you. From a very early age, we discover this need within ourselves, not just to get even, but to get ahead. Like, forgiveness doesn't seem natural, does it? It doesn't feel like it's natural. What seems to be primary, what seems to arise first, is retaliation, punitive behavior, vengeance, right? These seem to almost be a part of us in how early we see them displayed. We all have countless stories of siblings and children doing this to each other, right? We all know it. It's cliche at this point. Everyone knows this is how siblings act. But have you ever seen a 3-year-old say, bruh, I see that you hit me. Not because of something wrong with me, but because of something you're dealing with. This won't destroy my sense of being, and I still love you. And I'd like for us to work on this together so that we can learn to have a deeper connection as brothers. Right? Have you ever seen a 3-year-old do that? I have not. And I'm not saying it's not out there. I'm trying to make the point that this principle, right, what we're calling sin, is universal. It's a shared experience. And one person's experience of it seems to suck us into that experience. But what is sin? Right? I've said that it's a principle. I'm saying that it's universal. It's all around us. But what is it? Is it just the bad things we do? Is it some sort of breaking of divine law? I think it's deeper than that. I'm using the word principle on purpose. I think it's a good word. Right? I think a proper understanding, being able to speak to the idea of sin in a way that actually encourages transformation and healing for us all, demands that we not see it as a thing or a kind of action, but rather it's a way of being that is at work among us. I say principle at work because we've all seen and experienced the way that something destructive in someone else stirs up something within ourselves. Carl Jung said, "It is a fact that cannot be denied. The wickedness of others becomes our own wickedness because it kindles something evil in our hearts." Right? There's this sense in which sin seems to dwell outside of myself. There's this destructive kind of patterns around me. And yet there's also a sense in which it seems to dwell inside of myself and these play off of each other. So it's a principle that results in destructive behaviors. Okay. Might be the beginning of some sort of definition. I mean, we know what things are. We know, like, what evil is when we see it, don't we? Right? Like, we all recognize that someone clawing after wealth and therefore dominating others along the way, someone murdering out of anger or uncontrolled desire. Like, we recognize the principle at work when we see it. We know that it results in destructive behaviors. Where does it come from? What's going on? So many people have attempted to answer that question. The theologian Jürgen Moltmann pointed out that the destructive principle of our lives arises from our anxiety about our mortality. Right? And to some degree, the existentialists would all agree with him. Theologian Walter Wink says that the systems of evil we see within us and without us are primarily systems of domination, that we seek to rule over each other. René Girard tells us that sin is a result of when I mimic the desire I see in you, and then you mimic it back. It spirals out of control into violent action. However it is, right, that it all plays out, and this is three views among many others, they all have great powers of explanation. And as we begin to explore the various ways that all these different theologians and thinkers have thought about the idea of sin, we see that fundamentally it is the principle of broken relationships. Mimetic desire, a fear of our own destruction, and so guarding ourselves against others, dominating for more goods, right? Fundamentally, it is broken relationship. I'm reading a book right now called Exclusion and Embrace by Miroslav Volf. And he uses the word for sin, he uses the word exclusion for sin. Like, each of us is in the business of identity building, right? To be a human is to choose who you are and who you're going to be and how you're going to present yourself to others. It's to have a radical freedom that we can either choose to live in or choose to reject. But the thing is, we're not alone in this world, are we? Like, as you're going along your life, determining who you are, making choices that form who you are being, there's other people in the way, isn't there? You're radically free to be who you're going to want to be, but your freedom starts clashing with other people's freedom. We all have to be in relationship to other people who are all trying to be themselves as you're trying to be yourself. And that is not an easy task, is it? You may have heard the quip, hell is other people. Right? Figuring this life out would be a whole lot easier if I could just do it by myself. But that's the joke of it. There is no life apart from relating to other people. And so along the way, we begin to learn that in order to protect that identity, we must differentiate ourselves from other people. Right? That's all part of it. I'm me and I'm not you. But somehow, somewhere, we learn that we don't just differentiate ourselves from people, but we exclude them from ourselves. To protect my identity, I have to be right. Like, I have to know that I'm right and I'm on the right path. And that turns into, I need to make you wrong. In order for me to be right, that must mean you're wrong. This is the process of exclusion. And it seems to be built into the very nature of how we form our identities. It may not be. It may not be fundamental. And yet, whether it is or it isn't, we all end up violently excluding the other from ourselves. Maybe through physical violence, but always violently, in that we, in our minds, dominate others, force them to be something for us that they may or may not be, think of them as wrong in our eyes. And when we act on that process, what happens? The actions that we can call sin. The destructive behaviors towards others. We exclude others from ourselves, but we also exclude ourselves from ourselves. And we move through the world in fractured, split ways. We're at war internally. We lie to ourselves, we shame ourselves, and we're all disjointed. We're disjointed with ourselves, and we're disjointed from other people. And we live in isolation. We live in exclusion. This is what I mean when I say that sin is universal. Now, if this is coming off as depressing, I'm not meaning for it to. Right? And if you're feeling down about it, you don't need to. Because remember, the transformation, as we talked about last week, is necessary. Right? This sermon is meant to kind of bolster that. It's necessary. We see why. Because sin is at work, everywhere. But the encouraging thing is that it's possible. Right? Remember last week we said transformation is each person's responsibility to walk into. Next week we're going to look more at the principle called sin from the early stories of the Bible that unpack it, specifically the story of Cain and Abel. So I'd like for today just to end with a quote from that story, just so we can end on this note of kind of like hopefulness in the face of this seemingly all-pervasive principle of destruction. At one point in the story of Cain and Abel, God says to Cain, spoiler alert, in case you don't know the story, Cain's about to kill his brother. God says to Cain, hey man, why the long face? You better be careful. Sin is lurking like a wild animal, ready to pounce on you. But you can master it. You can master it. That's the hope. Right? Like, as universal as sin is, as much as it feels like it's fundamental, as much as it seems like it's bound up in the very way we form our identities, you can master it. We all can. So I hope that as I invited last week, you'll continue to join me on the path of transformation. I hope you'll come back next week, because if you just come this week, and you get all this like, oh man, we're fundamentally like destructive towards each other, without learning how to master it, that's not going to be very fun. So come back. Join me on this journey. Let's think about it. Let's open our eyes. Let's not be afraid to say that sin is real and it's out there, so that we can learn to master it together. Let's pray. God, guide us and bind our hearts together as we seek to live out embrace rather than exclusion. As we walk into healing and love and transformation, fundamentally changing ourselves. May you always lift our eyes up in faith towards the horizon, never letting us get bogged down in things that don't matter, details that only tear us apart. May we always be walking towards transformation. Amen. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and wine for the Passover meal, and he blessed them, gave thanks for them, and he said, "This is my body which is broken. This is my blood which is spilled for you." And a couple of the gospel writers tag on this little thing that says, "for the remission of sin." It's a really interesting phrase, isn't it? And it's so misused sometimes and misinterpreted. But there's something about what Jesus did in his life and in the way he died that brings us out of the power of these destructive ways of being. It's various, it's 10 sermons in itself. But as we partake in this act together, may we bring that into remembrance. May we bring it into our shared consciousness together here. May we dwell on it as one, knowing that we are on the path of mastering sin, that we are on the path of transformation, that we will not be torn apart, disjointed, and isolated by the destructive principles around us. We will be committed to healing, grace, mercy, and peace. Dwell on this as we partake together.